Hello, I'm here today with Devi Lockwood. Really happy to be interviewing her. Devi is the author of 1001 Voices on Climate Change, which you can see here. It's published by Simon & Schuster. It was published in August of 2021. And previously, she worked as an editor and writer at the New York Times opinion section. She spent 5 years traveling in 20 countries on 6 continents to document 1001 stories on water and climate change, which is obviously what the book comes from. And Devi works as the ideas editor at Rest of World. So welcome, Devi. It's really fun to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So I first came upon your work, maybe it was in the binders. I'm not sure, where you were, I think, just starting your trip, and you said, hey, I'm traveling around the world collecting these stories about water and climate. And at the time I was editing Anchor magazine, I said, hey, that would be a cool story. So you published a story for us, and now this book is here. And I'm really interested in your project on a lot of different levels, because obviously very interested in climate and environmental issues and what we can do. So that's kind of one side of me. And the other side of me is very interested in stories and the power of stories and how they can affect change and change us on the inside and the outside. So your book is doing both of these things. Can you just give us a little bit of background? How did it come to be that you were traveling and come up with this project?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of beginnings to the project. The shorthand is that it was sort of an assignment that I gave myself that I felt like I really wanted to do. And part of the inspiration for that came through the Boston Marathon bombings, actually. So I was living in the city at the time, and we were on lockdown for a couple of days. And the first thing that I wanted to do once that lockdown lifted was to connect and have face-to-face conversations with strangers, and to remind myself that not everyone was murderous. And so I walked around the city with a sign that just invited people to tell me stories about whatever was on their mind. And something about that felt really special. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And that summer I did a bike trip down part of the Mississippi River, where it was the same thing. I had that same cardboard sign around my neck, inviting people to tell me stories whenever I wasn't on the bicycle. And the farther down the river I was riding my bike, the more stories I was hearing about water and climate change, specifically saltwater encroachment on the land, or people making the decision to leave a place that they'd called home for generations in the aftermath of a big storm. And I wondered what it might mean to put those stories of water and climate change in dialogue with stories about water and climate change from other parts of the world.
Well,
to get a grant for a year of purposeful wandering after graduation, and then after 1 year I just kind of kept on going. So it turned into this thing that kind of had a life of its own, and got a lot bigger.
It's inspiring, and on a lot of different levels, because I think so often, especially here in Boston, people aren't comfortable just talking to strangers. So what was that like, even just to be out there with a sign around your neck saying, tell me a story about X, Y, or Z, to have people approach you and to kind of look different and to stand out in that way?
Yeah, at first it was pretty uncomfortable and weird, and then I got really used to it, and then I felt uncomfortable and weird when I didn't have it on. But I think that there was a way in which that piece of cardboard was a really good conversation starter, and it kind of broke down that frostiness or that ice that exists between people when you're not quite sure how to engage. And so I found that it was a really great tool for having all sorts of conversations that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really beautiful practice and lesson just in and of itself, right? To just talk to strangers and to listen to one
Yeah.
another's stories and
Hmm.
to be open, and
Yeah, it was
kind of
hard, really fun.
generosity also of people offering their stories.
Yeah, definitely came to see every story as a gift. And um, I think I also got a lot, like another gift was the practice of doing this made me a much better listener over time.
Mm.
So I used to interrupt a lot more or be focused more on asking questions and not just being present with someone. And definitely learned how to slow down and listen better throughout the course of doing this journey.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And you talk about that in the book itself, the process of deep listening and how it developed. It's interesting because a lot of people I work with are writers, and we think about like, what does my story do? And your book is an example of all these people whose stories really are important. And I also really appreciate the fact that while you talk to some experts, you mostly talk to the people who just happen to come up to you and share their story with you, which I think is such a refreshing way to talk about something, really about anything, but something like climate change, which affects us all, water, which affects us all, which is part of all of us, right? Not to go to the experts to get the stories, but to go to normal people. And was that kind of, I don't know, what are your thoughts about that? And
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the main things I was trying to do in the interviews and in the book was to complicate the idea of expertise and to argue that lived experience is a form of expertise that is as valid as, study in a school or other forms of knowledge. And furthermore, that our understanding of issues as complicated and highly localized, but global as well as water and climate, our understanding will only be strengthened when we put the kind of quote unquote traditional experts in dialogue with people who are experts in their own lived experience of change as they see it in the places where they live. And for me, that was really important. And so I wanted to have that mix and wanted to put those stories in dialogue with each other. And I know it can be like maybe a sort of fragmented experience of jumping back and forth between these different modes of knowledge and reading the book. But my hope was to kind of, by putting them in dialogue with each other, creates a more of a mosaic or a better kind of survey or understanding of how we are discussing these issues over the course of the 5 years that I did the interviews.
yeah, there's so much there. I mean, and so often, expert opinions are really important, but our lives are lived through our physical, human bodies. And even if we're an expert in one thing, kind of like one thing that we maybe have a degree in, we're not an expert on those other areas that we're living in, except that we also are experts on them, right? Like that we're experts on our own life in a way that no one else can be. So this idea of expertise, like who's an expert in what, and we're all both experts and not experts. And I think that's something like as humans and as writers, we're always kind of blending that together, right?
Definitely. Yeah. And I think the other thing, as a reader or a listener or just a consumer of climate coverage in general, I think it can often be really abstract and numerical, and that way of discussing climate can feel really inaccessible to a lot of people. And so my hope was to give more of a kind of rounded story and multiplicity of voices to this topic that's perhaps easier to engage with than just the numbers alone. So we could talk about, a millimeter of sea level rise, but then it's stickier to think about the story of, one specific mother on one specific island nation in the South Pacific who's impacted by this and having to make tough decisions in terms of water allocation for her family.
Yeah, it definitely, reading the book just the issues come alive in a different way from the way I've felt them before, because you do talk to so many people in so many places. And, it's almost reminding us to trust our own expertise, like our own experience, right? Like, I think at this point in 2021, we've probably all now experienced in our own lives the effects of climate change. Even last night here, the wind was just not the way I used to remember it being. It's just, everything is a little more intense, and you kind of realize, it's pretty powerful force out there.
Yeah.
I hope my house can make it through the night, because it's like the three little pigs, It's like
Sure.
we think we're all secure, and then some wind or some water or some fire just comes and knocks it down, and we can't really wait around for other people to tell us, oh, this is an issue, right? We know already this is an issue, and to have that kind of chorus of voices from all around the world saying, I'm seeing this, I'm feeling this, I'm knowing this with my own eyes and my own body, I think is really, really powerful.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad. Yeah.
I mean, and you also, it's interesting because you work in media, and
Mhm.
one of the things that's frustrating is the insufficient, I think, coverage of what's happening with climate change and with people, right? Like that this is a human issue. This is not
Mhm.
just about polar bears. That this is
Right.
really, really,
Yeah.
really affects people. And those stories aren't usually front and center. And so
Yeah.
what's it like for you to have these different kinds of ways of sharing stories? And
Sure. I mean, the people first mentality is something that I try to keep front and center of all of the work that I do, including the journalism stuff, the editing, the writing, whatever it is. Just because I think as a reader, it makes it activates those empathy muscles, right? Or just makes it easier to understand something when it's more tactile and present in that form of storytelling. Um, but again, it's just a way to enliven the numbers or to make it feel the issues feel more urgent and accessible. And like you said, it's becoming harder to ignore, and that the issues related to climate and to water are closer to home with every passing year, right? So I think that it's just ever more important to find new ways of discussing these stories so that we're not falling into the same polar bear tropes or um just looking for new and innovative ways to tell the story so that it doesn't feel overdone or unimportant or at worst it would just be easy to ignore, right?
well, I mean, it's both like feels overdone, but also underdone, right?
Mm,
We have so many, I mean, I can't even begin to count the number of stories about COVID,
mhm.
right? Which is seriously disruptive of our lives, but the climate crisis and the environmental crisis is on a magnitude that's in some ways so much bigger and has the potential to have change that's so much enormously bigger, and yet it's such a tiny, tiny fraction of the stories that we read about in the news. So
Sure. I mean, I think another thing that's difficult about climate and just telling the story of it is that it can be a thing that moves both fast and slow, but for the most part is kind of in the what feels like a far off future, right? 2050 is not actually that far from now, but it feels like a long time away, right? And so there's a way in which telling a story about the present necessitates telling a story about the future when it is stories about climate change, and that sometimes is really hard.
yeah, but again, like as an illness, when you go to the doctor and they're like, you know, hate to tell you, you're feeling really good, but you have a cancerous growth. You're not like, oh, you know what? That's in the future. I'm feeling
Right.
fine now.
Right.
It's like
Yeah.
it's the present. Um, and I
Yeah.
think stories really bring that home, the magnitude of it. That like what we're seeing now is, it's like the inverse of the iceberg. It's like the ice that image of like you're seeing the tip of the iceberg, but we're seeing the tail end of the iceberg instead or something.
Mm.
Um, did your ideas writing the book change over the 5 years? Like, did you have a different perception of the anything really, the magnitude of the crisis, what it's like to talk to people? You talked a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I mentioned the listening component already and just getting better and more confident at that, but kind of realizing where my own blind spots and weaknesses were and then working really actively to get better. Um, I didn't have the idea to write a book when I started out. I originally wanted it to be an audio map online where you could click on a point and listen to a story from that place. And there is kind of a beta version of that, but it's not I guess ultimately what the project turned into. But yeah, I think I just learned, there's not one place I went to where people didn't have a story about climate, right? And so it is such a global phenomenon, and I feel really one of the defining issues of my generation. But more than that, in addition to the problems being felt everywhere, I was really heartened to learn about, some of these hyper local solutions that people are working on. Um, and some of the ones that moved me the most were kind of looking at multiple issues at once. So, for example, there's this one woman named Nadia Colburn who I met in New Zealand, in a town called Wanganui, which is on the banks of the Wanganui River, and there's a wetland there that was used as a landfill for multiple decades, and it was unlined. And so there's still all of this, even though it's been decommissioned and capped, there's all of this pollution in the soil and in the water surrounding the landfill. And so she spent something like 20 years restoring that wetland and hauling out tires and finding different ways to coax native plants and animals to return. And the wetland is really thriving in a way that it once wasn't. And now she's using this place as a site for environmental education for kids in her community, to get them also more involved with being able to identify the wildlife and the plants, but also in understanding the importance of conservation and preservation of places like that. And what's fun about having this, having done this for multiple years and on multiple continents, is that there's a similar initiative. It's also led by an indigenous group in Amazon, who I was fortunate to spend some time with in Peru, and they're making this living library of medicinal plants, right? Where they've set aside a certain number of hectares to ensure that it won't be logged in the future, and are going through and just cataloging all of the plants that have different uses, working with elders in the community to preserve that knowledge, write it down, and try to re-educate kids who have been educated only in Spanish, so not in the Shipibo language, and have just different ways of accessing that in the future. And they're also hoping to create kind of an ecotourism site on this land to provide an alternate source of income that doesn't have to do with the logging industry. And yeah, it's just really interesting to have those conversations, because not only does it become clear how people are really invested in problems locally and finding solutions, but also that some of these hyper local solutions can kind of speak to each other and be in dialogue across space and time.
Right. Yeah. So cool how those stories can kind of speak to one another.
Mhm.
One of I'm sure you've gotten this question before. So what do we do when we read your book? What is the effect? Like what effect do you want your book to have? And I think that's a question about this book, but then a question in general, I think, for us as writers. What effect does our words have? Do our words have? Um, and what are your dreams, and have you seen any kind of cause and effect from your book?
Yeah, so I wrote this book for people who know a little bit about climate change, but don't feel like they have a big grasp on all of the impacts of it globally, or for people who feel overwhelmed by climate change, or that it's kind of too much to even think about and take on. And so my hope is that this gives people a different way of accessing and understanding the impacts of climate change that are being felt right now in different parts of the world. Um, and also, frankly, because it was a book I wanted to read but hadn't read, about what all of these impacts were, and the people who are living with climate change right now, and how they're talking about these problems and prioritizing their voices. That for me felt really interesting, but like something that didn't already exist. Um, my hopes are manifold. I think in the like distant, far off future, my hope is that this can be kind of an archive for someone to unearth and understand how we were talking about these issues at this exact point in time. And for kind of the here and now, my hope is that it breaks, it is sort of an intervention into climate silence because it can be so hard to have conversations about climate change, right? So this text is really meant as a conversation starter, as a way of breaking that ice, as a way of finding new ways of telling a story about climate, and also just getting people to reflect on the ways that their own lives are being impacted by climate change right now, and hopefully it'll inspire people to be more open in not only listening to other people's stories about these issues, but in sharing their own.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I'm really struck by your saying, like, to break the silence. A lot of, a lot of the work I think that writers do across fields is breaking silence, and the cultural kind of weight of silence. And so if you break silence in one place, it will kind of shatter the ice and break it in other places as well. Um, and so, for people who are maybe listening, but climate change is just one of their many interests. It's like, oh, well, any silence that we break will help break that heavy concrete to allow the voices to speak out against all different kinds of silences. Like, there's not just like one climate silence and one, sexual violence silence and one racial silence or whatever it is. And even in your book, in the story, you have a moment of kind of needing to deal with a traumatic experience, going back home for a while, healing, coming back out into the world, and it feels like all of the different kind of levels of stories of silence, of speaking, interact. And I'm sure when you set out to write, you didn't know that you were going to have that experience.
Yeah, it just kind of happened. Yeah.
But I love that you wove it into the book, and so that the book itself, like the structure of the book, happens like there's a kind of like healing structure in there. I don't know. Do you have anything? How did you weave that in, and how did that work? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of going back and forth on whether or not to include it, and ultimately decided to, because I just thought maybe it'll help someone else if they go through a similar experience, or but yeah, I don't know, it just seemed important, and was connected, just in as much as I found that I had to be, even though I didn't really want to at first and resisted it, but I had to be the narrative sinew of this book in many ways, because I was the one who went around recording all these stories, and that it wouldn't make much sense if I tried to edit myself out. And so I was just trying to stay true to that impulse, and be present as the connective tissue between all of these different stories and all these different places, and being the one who had done the listening to them. So that's sort of why I left it in.
And just for people who haven't read the book, but I hope you do, so you had this kind of bad interaction with someone in a van, or in Cambodia, is that right? Was it?
Yeah, on the border between Laos and Cambodia. Yeah.
It struck me as interesting that it happened in that place, and not to be stereotypical, but I remember my sister was traveling in that part of the world, and her experiences in Cambodia were very difficult. And Cambodia is a place where there was just such trauma.
Sure.
Just like in the landscape. And I've never been there, but people who have, I've heard different stories about it. So, it's like there are these different levels of traumatic history that get replayed. Perhaps things like that could happen anywhere. Certainly it can happen in the United States. Absolutely. But even when it happens in the United States, it's often replaying older cultural trauma, right?
Sure.
Or not even, especially, right? Like, so that there are these different levels of personal trauma, historic trauma, environmental trauma that are interacting and kind of get woven into the story of all of our lives.
For sure. Yeah, that's a good way of saying it.
And that I was really, I love many parts of the book, but I was especially struck by the stories about the ex-Soviet Union.
Sure.
And the ways in which the massive state planning created massive environmental destruction. Um,
Sure.
and just the ways in which, again, any one story has multiple layers. And here we're often thinking about, capitalism and the climate crisis and environmental destruction. And there's a direct link, but also communism and environmental destruction. And so, I don't know, do you want to tell us a little bit about your time in that part of the world and share some of this?
Yeah, sure. So I was invited by the US Consulate General in Kazakhstan to go and spend a couple weeks there, and went to this festival that they were putting on, but then they also had me traveling around in a different part of the country, and then also cross the border into Kyrgyzstan for a little bit. And yeah, it was just a really incredible experience. It was one of the first times, or I guess the first time, that I was working directly with a videographer and and a translator, and they had someone who was also helping to drive us around. So I wasn't on the bike at that point, but it was super interesting. And you kind of alluded earlier to the story about the Aral Sea. So I met I think a physician who was telling me about how centralized planning for growing cotton in an area where probably cotton shouldn't have been grown, just led to the depletion of water, such that the Aral Sea, which used to be a vibrant fishing community or series of towns surrounding this massive inland sea, just became completely dried out, and it's now really desolate. And some people still live there, but it's really difficult for them to get by. And not only was it, a water intensive crop to be growing in an area with very dry soil, but there was also this sort of, I think, more or less concrete canals that were created to transport the water from the source to the fields. And there was just a huge amount of evaporation along the way. So yeah, it was interesting. It was a story that I hadn't heard before I was there, but kind of an example of how that sort of planning and design can go awry and then have really long lasting effects.
Yeah, yeah, that was what just really struck me. And then I think the physician you were talking to said that he had known one of the men who was responsible for designing it, and he knew all along that he didn't really know what he was doing, but
Sure.
was, communist like regime, he couldn't really speak out and had to just, anyway, just the kind
Yeah.
of roles that people are forced into, and the bigger stories that we're living under. um because we have these individual voices, and they're kind of like the different levels of story and idea, like, oh, I have a great idea, let's move the sea and build, you know these canals, or I have this great idea, let's I don't know, just build, 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 and never stop building, because that's what growth
Sure.
is. Or that we're all kind of living within different stories and like composing our story out of that.
Yeah, yeah. And just the ways in which focusing on infrastructure, but not taking other factors into account, especially the environment, can have these effects.
Yeah. Um, well, anyway, I really enjoyed the book. I also wanted to say it's really enjoyable to read. Like, it
Oh,
really did
good.
feel kind
Yeah.
of like, oh, I get to go on this trip. It's a travel book. So you get to meet people and um, go to beautiful places, go to difficult places. I loved your descriptions of being on the boat, made me feel seasick, but also expansive. Um,
I'm glad.
anyway, it
Yeah.
was very enjoyable to read. And even though the topic is a big and difficult one, it also felt actually quite affirming. It didn't feel
Mm.
overwhelming. It felt like, look, here are all these amazing people all around the world um, who are sensible, like, it kind of made me feel uh, just more faith again in humanity. Whatever we're doing, that people are generally kind and
Mm.
thoughtful and um, you know caring and all of those things.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah, that's really great to hear. I'm so glad.
what are you working on now?
Yeah, so kind of in addition to my day job, obviously it's not really possible to travel and report at the moment, but been noodling around with a fiction manuscript at night, which I can't say a lot about because it's kind of a mess right now. But I think what I like most about that is just learning how to write in a completely different form, and that sort of beginner mindset where I don't really know what I'm doing, but trying to apply some lessons of this past book into the next one. And yeah, who knows if it'll ever see the light of another reader's eyes, but that's been fun. And yeah, aside from that, just talking to people about this book has been really fun.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
And I like to end with 3 questions. So
Sure.
just recommendations to kind of share the love with people. And again, here's Debbie's book. Oh, actually, before we go to that, is there a short section of the book that you might want to read aloud so people can hear you reading it?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Do you have any particular requests?
I should have asked you that before we came on the call.
That's
Do you want
okay.
maybe something from like Tuvalu? That was powerful.
Sure, yeah.
Sort of, um,
Um, hmm. Just trying to choose a section that I don't always read. Okay.
or you can read a section that you always read if you have a favorite section that you love to read. Go ahead and read that because probably most people here won't have heard it.
No, it's good. It's good. I'll just read brief, kind of to give more of a people sense. But it's this little section in the Tuvalu chapter is called Family. I met Alafanga while buying a scratch-off internet card to connect with home. She was working at the telecom stand selling plastic cards with data plans. I asked her if she knew of anyone who might have extra room for a stranger. Let me ask around at lunch, she said. Come back in the afternoon. I walked out to a dock on the lagoon side of the island where pieces of coral nestled like bones among the sand. Big white cumulus clouds lavished their rain elsewhere. I watched them drift close to the island and then pass, their underbellies dark with water. Rains in Tuvalu come heavy and all-encompassing single cloud storms that are completely unlike the all-day gray sky rains I'm used to in New England. Here I learned rain is a gift. In the afternoon, I walked back up to the internet stand. Alafanga stood behind it, staring out into the street, empty except for a passing moped. You can stay with us, she said. Bring your stuff and we'll go. I followed her out the back door and through a tangle of houses nestled close together, past outdoor kitchens under awnings and clothes strung out to dry beneath the roofs. Alafanga introduced me to her grandmother, her aunts, her cousins. A stand-up fan ruffled the edges of family photographs taped to the walls. I put my bags down. For a few weeks, this was home. Every morning, I woke up at dawn to Alafanga's grandmother singing in Tuvaluan. One word I understand, Jesus. In Tuvalu, we have this saying, you cannot lift a cup with one finger. In other words, we need our family to survive, Alafanga told me. Of the 11,000 people who live on Tuvalu's 10 square miles of land, about 6,000 live in Funafuti, in densely populated homes. The islands are a culture of extended family. Most nights, 10 to 12 siblings, aunts, grandparents, and cousins crashed out on woven mats on the floor, competing for space closest to the fan, which pushed a spiral of hot air towards us as we slept. Everyone shares rice and fish and fruit. Alafanga introduced me to her cousin, Losite, who is 2 years younger than I am. I asked Losite if she could take me out to see the now defunct wells. Sure, she shrugged, but it's not much to see. We walked out behind a stand of houses shaded by coconut trees. A pile of stones stood at the center of a circular rock, no taller than my shins. We peered in. At the bottom, some 10 feet down, was a muddy puddle. I caught a glimpse of coconut husks and potato chip packet. It's all garbage, this, Losite said. No water here. While living with Losite and her family, I learned how to conserve water. Every drop from the rain was precious and to be treated as such. Between rains, there was always the question, will there be enough water in the tank to get through the day? And if not, how can we cut back? Alofanga taught me to turn off the tap while I lathered up my body and untangled my mess of curls. We snuck into the bathrooms at her workplace after hours to bathe. She had keys, and no one else was using the water in those big tanks, she told me. The bigger the roof, the more water that funnels into the water tanks. And the Tuvalu Telecom building, a 2-minute walk from our home, had one of the largest roofs in Funafuti. The whole ordeal had an air of secrecy about it. We went at dusk and always entered through the back door because we never knew who might be watching. The island, a small community, has many eyes. Under the telecom shower spigot, I relaxed. Cool water dripped down my back, washing away days of caked on sweat. The other solution to not showering is to dance. In Tuvalu, community members gathered after dark in open air halls. Everyone in the audience brought a bottle of perfume, imported, of course, and we sat on the perimeter of the hall, large and open to the breeze. People stood up to dance in groups of 2 or 3. If someone liked the dancers, they walked up to them and doused them in perfume as they continued to move to the beat, drawing an X in the space around their bodies in motion. People cheered. The speakers were loud, stacked 2 or 3 high, the bass rumbling near maximum volume. The music carried us through. So kind of just to give a sense of some of the life in Tuvalu, but also ways that people cope with water shortages. And earlier on in that chapter, I talk about how there used to be a freshwater lens under the island, but it became both salty and contaminated, mostly due to sea level rise.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful chapter, and just beautiful writing.
Thank you.
I feel like I get to go on an adventure with you. The dancing with the perfume is such a
it's a fun detail. I was definitely surprised. Yeah.
But also just that reminder to every drop of water is precious.
Yeah,
for sure. Really, really limited. So thank you so much. So now my final 3 questions, just very quickly. So is there a book or a piece of music or something that you really enjoy that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, okay. So book-wise, I've really been enjoying this book by Andre Snare Magnusson, who's an Icelandic writer. It's called All Time and Water. He's dealing with a lot of similar themes to what I was dealing with in the book, but centered in one place and looking, trying to understand, what 2050 and 2100 might be like through looking at Iceland's past and thinking about both the past and the future of his family. And I find that way of storytelling and imagination really affirming and moving, and it's just a gorgeous book. Yeah. Thank you.
My other question is there a practice that you do to stay centered and grounded? I mean, we didn't talk about how people can get overwhelmed by this, but I think your whole book is really, as I said, life affirming. But are there practices that you do aside from maybe bicycling?
Yeah, I was going to say, while actually recording the stories, I found the time on my bike to be really restorative and necessary. And that was how I kept going, was by having that time to think and recenter. But I guess I sort of recreated some of that same motion during the writing process. I mean, I wrote most of it during the pandemic year, so it wasn't super possible to go out and do things with other people, but I could go out and go hiking, and was based fortunately very close to the White Mountains in New Hampshire. And there's 48 peaks in New Hampshire that are higher than 4,000 feet. And so I went about ticking off all the hikes on that list, and just finished a couple weekends ago, actually. So it was really fun to have a goal that was adjacent to the writing and had nothing to do with it. The funny thing is now, like, I have to write an essay for the Appalachian Mountain Club if I want to get this little patch. And I really do want the patch because I was a Girl Scout and I'm very motivated by patches. That was part of the reason why I wanted to do all these hikes. Of course, it's not about the patch, but it's just funny to have done something to kind of get away from writing and then have to write to finish it. But yeah, I just recommend getting outside and moving. It's a way of getting unstuck from all sorts of things. It's really hard to feel inertia when moving through a really beautiful landscape and getting to see some gorgeous views in all seasons.
Yeah, lovely. And then my final question, is there some way that you take action outside of your writing maybe on a larger systemic level or political level, or it could be some other level that you just want to tell people about and recommend or
Yeah.
share?
I'm kind of limited just because of my profession and what I can do, because in journalism, there's these like sharp divides about not being an activist or being an advocate. And so because I so desperately want to write about these issues, and I see that as like the strongest intervention that I can do, it means that, I don't go to a protest unless I'm covering it or something like that. But yeah, I think for folks who are interested in getting involved with these issues, the best way to start is internally by understanding your own strengths and having a great conversation with yourself about what your strengths are and what brings you joy, and then plugging in with organizations who are doing that kind of work locally, whether that's 350 or the Sierra Club or the Legal Conservation Voters. There's all sorts of groups that are in need of help, and that they can kind of help plug people in with causes that are even more local and specific, because it's pretty much impossible as one person to take on all of climate change or all of environmental issues that have to do with water, for example. But there's really specific small slices of things that have local impacts that are easier to tap into as an individual.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And just kind of like full circle, right? That your book reminds us that the personal is local and global at the same time. And I think that's just in itself, like it's just a practice to remember. We're in our bodies, we're in our individual lives. We can do what we can do in our bodies. We can go climb the mountains. We can take action in the ways that bring us joy and connection locally, and that's globally also, and is all connected. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
fun to
you.
talk to
Great
you.
to chat with you. Yeah, really glad.
Be really well.
You too.